How many folks here are based outside of Austria? Just stand up if you're based outside of Austria. Okay, okay. And if you're based in Austria, stand up. I assume that's everybody else. Well, I have to say, you have a beautiful country here in Austria. You can sit down now. When I look at what's going on in Austria, I think back to kind of what Philip and Christian and Stephanie and the rest of the campaigning bureau have done with this convening, and it's actually quite remarkable, maybe even revolutionary. And when I'm thinking about Austria, long before Austria was known for its torts and for love and all of these beautiful things, there was this whole idea of classical music, the Viennese classical era. And it came about during a time when, a lot like now, a lot of folks came to Vienna and started to redefine what was old and what was new music. And it made people think differently. At the time, the classical musicians were the revolutionaries of their time, right? Beethoven, Haydn, Mozart. Well, very much so. I want to thank the Campaigning Bureau for bringing us together, because this is truly a remarkable moment to have all of us in one room, to be able to learn from each other. Before I drive into what I have to share with you today, I want to actually get a sense of where you are at. You've heard from many speakers today. It's been a fantastic collection of wisdom. So for right now, if you could just look at the 2 or 3 people sitting right around you or next to you, I want to give you 3 minutes just to converse with each other about what is one big thing that you learned today. Something interesting that surfaced that you wouldn't have otherwise. So 3 minutes, you have 3 minutes, 2 or 3 people around you, go. One more minute. You have 1 more minute. Okay, let's bring it back in. Let's bring it back in. Could I get some volunteers to at least just raise their hand and share a little bit of some of the interesting things that you heard about? Back there. Stand up and project. We are family here. Tell us your name too.
Hello, my name is Eren, and I'm from Upper Austria. And the most important thing that I have learned today is that campaigns are easy. Campaigners have to think easy and have to think what is the first thing that people who see the campaign, hear the campaign, or read about the campaign are going to think at first. And the other thing that I think that is important is the word and. And to forget about but. Thank you.
Yes, and is there another person who would like to share what they learned? Over here up front. And just introduce yourself as well.
So I'm Phil, I'm from Brussels, and for me it was in the Twitter presentation where hashtags have become the new headline and the new political drive of conversation.
Anyone else? Come on, surely we learn more than this. There's one hand
fear
right
beats
there.
Facts. Fear is more powerful than facts. Sorry, emotions are more powerful than facts.
Fear and hope. One more right over here.
I have learned that you have
And just introduce yourself first.
I'm Mustafa Durmus from Graz, from Styria. I have learned that it's all about storytelling, and you have to tell the stories at the moment when they're happening.
Timing matters, storytelling matters. Okay, one more exercise before I jump in, I promise. I'm not going to only listen to you. This time 2 minutes, and in that same group, I want you to spend 2 minutes just discussing what you want to get out of this last presentation. Out of this last presentation, what do you want to get out of it? Okay, 2 minutes, go. One more minute. One more minute. Okay, let's bring it back in. Three volunteers from the crowd. Raise your hands just to share what you'd like to get out of this session. This is going to be very easy for me. In the back, over here, Twitter.
Yes. Tell me, so what I want to get out of this...
And introduce yourself. I know everyone's already heard from you today, but...
Isa Sonnenfeld from Twitter. What I want to learn from you is, or tell us a bit more about love and torch. And your story about Mozart, and you know what I'm talking about.
Fantastic.
Just a joke.
Some of that might be show and not tell, but... That's a great hashtag, by the way. Love and torch. Anyone? Nothing? Okay, this is. You guys are setting a very low bar for me. Rob?
Okay, I'll I'd just like to point out that we all know exactly what you're doing, which is you're just making sure that you deliver the presentation that's going to make people very, very happy. So we're pre-populating the content of your presentation.
One has to write it at
well,
some point.
exactly. And we would be very interested to hear how something as iconic as the White House, which might seem quite distant to people, can motivate people in the way that it has done over the course of the Obama administration.
Love it. Love it. Is there anything else anyone wants to add to that? Because I think that's probably the special piece, right?
Yeah, I'll just say, what can we learn as Europeans from what's been done in the US, in the White House? So what's the perspective for us here in Europe?
Terrific. Then what I'll do a little bit is I'll introduce myself. I'll take you through kind of a summary of some of the landscape that you've probably already heard. But I want to get into some case studies. And then I want to boil it down for you about how the lessons that we learned then at the White House can be applied to anything, right? Especially now, right? And then maybe I'll have one last ask of all of us, right? My name is Toby Chaudhuri. I am the co-founder of an organization called SocialxDesign. I am also a now former advisor to the White House. I cut my teeth in democratic politics first. Many years ago, started managing campaigns in a state called Massachusetts on the eastern side of the U.S. Our campaign won, and I slowly went up the ranks and eventually started managing campaigns, first at a local legislative level and then up to statewide. Became Al Gore's deputy press secretary, the Vice President Al Gore's deputy press secretary when we ran for president in the year 2000, a long time ago. And I also worked in the Clinton White House doing communications work. When George Bush came into office, George W. Bush, that is, we stole all the W's off of our keyboards. And I went to the movement side, worked with NGOs, one called Common Cause, which was designed to take the corruptive influence of money out of politics. One was the Children's Defense Fund, which was really looking at tackling inequality and poverty through the eyes of a child. And then I worked in a think tank, in a few different think tanks, as well as with the party, and eventually then joined a small startup political consultancy where we really focused in on mobile communications. This is years ago. One of my buddies was big on the Obama campaign. We did a lot of work together. And I was coming from a traditional communications background, and he came with a bit of a forward-looking communications background. And we started to experiment. So we worked with the majority leader in our U.S. Senate, Harry Reid, and his re-election campaign, and several different senators who that year, for Democrats to actually win Senate seats was an odd outcome. But then I went on to work in the White House. They pulled me in more as an advisor. I didn't want to come into the White House in the same way that I'd served the Clintons. But there was a very specific challenge that they gave me, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I think the key here is that, in short, I'm very much a political strategist. I'm a communication strategist, a management strategist, which right now is what we all kind of do. And when it comes down to it, I'm probably no different from all of you in this room, right? I get my motivation from probably the same place where you get your motivations. I got involved in politics because of the struggles I saw my parents overcome growing up. They came to America in 1960 as immigrants. This was 5 years before there was a Civil Rights Act in America, so they didn't necessarily have the right to vote, although they weren't really aware of that. But watching their struggles really informed my politics. And that's what's beautiful about this convening, right? Is that in a democratic society, right, it's in the making. It's how democracy is made. That's what campaigning is all about. And for me, that goes back to my family and what drives me. You know, on the way here today, my mother called me. I got a SIM card here local, and so she tried it out. She calls me up, and I was telling her that I was coming to speak to you all. And to this day, she isn't exactly sure what I do. So she kind of went there, right? And she said to me, you know, Toby, I used to always say to you, you know, the truth that I really don't know what you do. And the truth is, she always did say to me, she said, Toby, you will never amount to anything in life. And for one reason, really. And that's because I procrastinate. I save everything to the last minute. And every time my mother said that to me, I always said, Ma, just wait. But I realized something here, which is that for a lot of us, some of that waiting is done. And why some of it is done is because this is an extraordinary moment. If there's one message that I have for all of us here, it's very simply to wake up. And I don't mean wake up because this is the end of the day, but I mean wake up because in so many different ways, politics has fallen asleep in the middle of a revolution. all of the different trends that you heard about today, all of the different paradigm shifts signal exactly the tip of the iceberg of what's possible out there. Now, what makes this moment extremely extraordinary are a few different things. First, there's the demand. There's a lot of work to do. If you really think about it, we have a long way before everyone who wants a job can get a job. We have a very long way to go before our middle-class communities can actually accept folks from the bottom rungs and actually provide some security, especially now. We live in a system that is extremely expensive. We were just hearing about it from Shane. But if you think about it, the last US presidential election, we spent upwards of $7 billion. $7 billion. If you look at what's happening around the world, in India, they just had a big election where they spent about the equivalent of $5 billion. $5 billion. Now, in a place like India, that is an even bigger deal because the buying power is like of a dollar is about times 5, right? And so there are questions that we have to ask about this, right? Where does this money come from? And a lot of those questions were asked today. But these are the kinds of things that we have to deal with, especially at a time when we are seeing some of the most complex problems that our communities have ever seen. And they're frankly so complex that the old ways of solving them may or may not work the same way, right? So what are the different elements, right? We've talked about the tech shift, right? We've talked about how if you look at the 21-year-old today, chances are that 21-year-old has watched anywhere from 20 to 30,000 hours of television. They have maybe played about 10 to 15,000 hours of video games. Today, at CES, there are all kinds of platforms that they were talking about where people can actually log on to watch other people playing video games. And literally, there are over 500,000 people logging in to do this every day. It's amazing. It's a whole different landscape. All of a sudden, professional sports looks like video games. If you think about what we're hearing about mobile, right? Most people, by the time they're 21 years old now, have sent somewhere around 250,000 emails and IMs, mostly from some kind of mobile device. Think about that. If you think about it, right now, the average 21-year-old in most of our markets, about half of them have actually created content that is on the internet. If you look at 4-year-olds now, I think in the US right now, 70% of 4-year-olds have actually created content on the internet. 4-year-olds. Now, when I first got involved in politics, when we were doing presidential politics on the Gore campaign, we knew, for example, that we could put something on television, at least 3 different private commercial networks in a particular market, and we knew that we could hit about 75% of the viewers in that particular market. Well, today things have changed, right? There are many more channels now. When you think about the time it takes to reach an audience of 500 million people, 500 million people, that's a lot of people. If you look at mediums like radio, it's been done. It's been done in about a 38-hour span of time. If you think about all the different things that we're hearing in the news cycle out there on television, it takes about 13 hours on television to hit an audience of 500 million. But to hit an audience of 500 million on the internet now, thanks to Twitter and other platforms, it takes less than 4 hours. It takes less than 4 hours. Now, there are so many devices out there. What does this say to us? It says that all of a sudden, because of the way new technologies are working, there are actually new ways that we can solve our problems. There are new ways that we can do what we're supposed to do. If you think about even just the content itself, the context has changed completely. Now, it used to be, again, even as early as 5 or 6 years ago, that if you had a piece of video, it was actually a property, right? It was either a VHS, a DVD, a Blu-ray. It lived somewhere. It was something that folks actually scheduled time to watch. Well, if you think about this new millennial generation, to them, video is actually disposable, right? Video is something that you make on your phone, you pop up on Vine, and then it disappears. You put it up on Snapchat, and then several seconds later, it doesn't exist anymore, right? If you think about that, just the photo itself. About 100 years ago, no one even took photos. And then somewhere in there, slowly, more and more photos started to be taken, and now there are over 300 million photos taken every day. And just 5 years ago, all of a sudden, there was a big drop-off in the number of printed photos, right? It's all digital right now. Now, the big question here is, what does this mean for us? Well, one of the beautiful things about working with the White House is that I got a chance to meet some folks that you wouldn't otherwise get to meet. And we were out in Silicon Valley once, and we brought together a group of folks out there who were doing a lot of work that was well known in Silicon Valley, but not so well known, certainly in Washington, D.C. and other parts of the world. These are folks who are working in gamification, right? The folks who are working with Zynga to actually figure out what is the core loop of a user. At what point does a gamer come into the system? At what point are they actually drawn in a core loop that's about 30 seconds long to stay playing? What is that 5-minute loop? What's that daily loop? What is the loop that keeps that user coming back every week? And there are actually touch points that are optimized to figure that out. Now, one of the labs that I was working out with in Palo Alto, which later partnered up and became part of our firm, it was where LinkedIn was spawned. And when you think about the business model behind LinkedIn, most folks think that they get most of their funding from a modest amount of advertising online and subscriptions that job seekers and employers pay to use the platform. The reality is, if 10,000 people are laid off at Vodafone, on the back end, LinkedIn sees that before the markets see it. Think about this. They've actually gamified the experience of employment to the point where over 100 million people are actually either updating their information or searching for some kind of criteria of information on LinkedIn. So in real time, LinkedIn can actually see real-time shifts in the labor markets by geography, by sector, across the board. And daily, that information is actually sold to fund managers on Wall Street. That is their business model. A couple of my friends just the other day, we were up in New York City just 10 days ago, and we convened folks from Madison Avenue, the big Mad Men advertisers, and the tech folks off of Wall Street. Because this is a big thing that's happening now with digital data. It's all of a sudden, it doesn't matter if you're trying to get soccer moms or single men or college-educated whatever. All of a sudden, if you look at the way Wall Street does its work, well, you don't want to watch that too much. But what they essentially have done is there are mathematicians who are sitting and looking at 15-second intervals to see where there's just a little bit of a nudge, a little bit of a profit. And they're bulldozing billions of dollars into that to create profit in 15-second intervals. Well, think about that now in a time of transmedia. What does that mean is possible when it comes down to advertising? Is it possible to do every 15 seconds to just see where the energy is flowing on what kind of banner ad, on what kind of site? Well, the reality is all of a sudden it doesn't matter what your target audience is. Your audience is the folks who are going to just get you from point A to point B. But because of the way that technology is operating now, it's a lot of our offline actions that now can be measured in this kind of way online, in the digital world. And it's scary But yet, it opens the door for all kinds of opportunities. Another big shift right now is what I would call is demographic, right? Today, for example, in the US, there is no more mainstream. There are many streams. We're seeing the rise of diverse America just like the world is seeing the rise of diverse world, right? With the millennial generation being the largest population around the world, folks under the age of 35, we are seeing folks communicate in many different ways, in many different communities. And it's important to remember this because at the end of the day, our work is oftentimes about these networks. It's oftentimes about how we are communicating into all of these different streams. And as we widen the lens, not only are these trends happening, but there are huge, huge paradigm shifts, which are making us actually relook at issues from a different lens. So all of a sudden, the aging population problem that might be facing Europe or parts of North America may not be a problem. All of a sudden, it might be that they are the solution to the problem. So what are some of these big paradigm shifts? Well, we know big data is a big deal. We know that there's this unstoppable rise of the sharing economy. Those of us who have worked in campaigns have always been familiar with the sharing economy because that's where our volunteers come from. But what kinds of tools and processes are available now that weren't available before? Take the example of Uber. You're all familiar with Uber, the ride-sharing program? Well, imagine if Uber had a slightly different business model. You know, folks oftentimes say that the disruption for Uber is going to be another Uber, Lyft, Sidecar. There's several of these apps out there. But the reality is what is actually going to disrupt Uber is when all of a sudden the drivers have equity in the actual platform. When the drivers are the owners, it'll actually democratize the ownership of Uber in a way that has never been seen before. Big sharing economy. There's also this idea of big local. This idea that all of a sudden, if you're able to create local, hyper-local networks or networks around communities, that you can actually scale very quickly. The rise of big local. Because of social media, we're seeing the rise of big followership. Now, all of a sudden, people's followership, which, used to be constituencies for many of us in our work, is now about followership. But across the board, there's a lot that happens with network effects. So how does this all relate to the work that we've done? Well, ever since I started working in politics, I feel like my opponents have always led one kind of campaign, which is the don't think campaign. They've always wanted the voters not to think. And the reality is all of us who work in this industry, we know that movements aren't acts of nature. They don't just happen, but they do force changes that otherwise wouldn't happen. Majorities don't just form, they're forged. Mandates aren't given, they're claimed. And as a result of this, the center is never frozen. Events may help shape them, but leaders, campaigns, and movements are what drive them. And that's why our work is so important. Now, when I look at my work in the White House, it came at a very interesting moment contextually. When I first got involved in politics again on that Gore campaign, I'll never forget it. Ben Green, our online director at the time, used to come to our staff meeting every week. This is the year 2000. And he used to say, guys, I have a great idea. We should send an email out from the campaign. And every week we'd say, that's very nice, dear. That entire presidential election, there was never an official mass email. Year 2000. 2004, all of a sudden, we had a candidate, Howard Dean, you've heard about him today, who came through and actually started to create an email organization, an online campaign from email. And that became part of the Democrats' campaign, and Move On came into the picture, and all of a sudden, email became a huge deal, right? Mostly for crowdsourcing money, but also to move a message. Then in 2008, we started to see the text message. SMS came into it. Obama started to deploy all kinds of things. I think Twitter came maybe at the end of that campaign. But then 2012 was coming, and, within the White House, there were a lot of questions that started to come up. And that's where I fell into the administration. The big core question was, how do we actually engage many of these different constituencies who are otherwise disengaged, but become very important when a demographic shift is moving in a particular direction, especially with 2012 down the road. So how do you engage at scale? No White House has really had to deal with the kind of changes in the electorate that this one did, right? So we started to look at many different scenarios. Well, the natural inclination right out of the gates was that we had to communicate our way out of it, that there must be a way to market this to get there. And if you looked at it, everything that the White House had been doing historically at this point to really communicate, to really engage populations, and this is long before there's a field operation on the campaign side, long before there's a digital operation on the campaign side, within the mold of governing. If you looked at it all, basically you had senior officials coming into a city. Maybe they delivered remarks, maybe it was a panel discussion, maybe they took some question and answer, and then they left. But was there any engagement that was coming out of it? It was all very linear change. And if nothing else, that whole idea of that power ladder, that exponential change, just wasn't going to work that way. And so I started working with several different teams at the White House that were focused on specific constituencies. And there was one that we got to experiment with in a fantastic kind of way, which was the Hispanic initiative out of the White House. And what we did with them, after we experimented a little bit, is we essentially brought open space technology onto an offline platform. Old-fashioned. We went into a city and we gathered about 500 community leaders. These are the folks who are the network leaders within their community, the folks with followership, the folks with credibility. And we started the process of deeply engaging them. So instead of giving them a speech and asking them for questions and answer, we actually gave them the floor. We said, okay, we're going to bring 24 senior officials dealing with many different issues here at the White House, and we, instead of giving you speeches, are going to open up the floor for the issues that matter to you. And so we had people come up on stage one by one to just define the issue that they wanted to deal with. Now, a couple things started to happen, because then we spent the next 8 hours of the day splitting up into small groups to actually answer 3 core questions. What is the issue? What is the barrier we're trying to overcome? And just simply, what's the next step in dealing with it? Few things started to happen. Let's say the issue were education. Well, because we've brought the convening power of the White House into town, it's not only the community leaders from within specific communities, but it's now state and local officials. It's business leaders. All kinds of folks have come together. And if they are actually self-interested, they can volunteer to be part of this working group on just defining the challenge with education. And all of a sudden, they defined a common purpose. And they defined a common way to actually deal with the next steps on this. And all of a sudden, we started to see partnerships come together. All of a sudden, private, public, social, everyone started to focus in on a next step. And as a result of that, the conference, the convening, became the beginning of a process, not the end. Now, this worked really well in one city. We ended up doing this in dozens of cities. We ended up doing this in about 55 different media markets. And what we found is all of a sudden we were able to engage tens of thousands of network leaders. Think about that. Tens of thousands of network leaders. Now, the way we used to do presidential anything was that we would try to find national surrogates, right? Ambassadors for our programming, spokespeople that we can put on the road. And it tended to be something like, maybe on a huge rollout, something like a dozen or so big names. And we would roadblock all the national television programs and put them on the road and have them give speeches. Well, all of a sudden, imagine this. We have the opportunity, because we have now deeply engaged these network leaders at the local level. We have the opportunity to do this at scale at the hyper-local level around particular communities. So this was the time when actually I left the White House project and went to the Obama campaign. And on the Democratic Party side, our team there, our entire mission was to light up these networks. And so how do you do that, right? And again, this is long before the field teams are sending out their emails, long before folks are knocking on doors, we're getting to the network effect. Well, with this kind of number, it's very difficult to manage any kind of surrogate program. So we did what anyone should do. We opened it up to them to manage each other. So we literally took an off-the-shelf program, Yammer. It's a lot like a private Facebook group. And we disciplined everyone to be on that and to do one of three things. We told them to share news and updates, share new ideas, innovations, and share emergency situations. And all of a sudden, something really interesting started to happen. All of a sudden, things that were happening in Las Vegas were becoming really helpful for folks to hear up in Cleveland. All of a sudden, things that were happening in Miami, an emergency situation, helped inform how folks were going to respond in another city. And just that sharing became really key to creating this learning network, this network that can learn from itself. Now, this is key because this is how network effects are created. And if we're going to scale, it's really important to look at this kind of network effect. Well, the beautiful thing about working with some of these folks in Silicon Valley is all of a sudden we started to look at design from new different ways. And they were very intrigued. All of a sudden the White House is rolling into town and instead of giving speeches is actually letting everyone else give them a speech from the audience. But this is not new thinking, right? Long before this, Apple changed the entire experience of how you walk into a showroom and actually do retail, right? The customer comes in, and now the cash register comes to the customer. But this entire concept of design is very key. And even as we look in the digital age, it's really important that we look at what that experience looks like. What are those touch points, and how do we optimize? Is it online? Is it offline? Is it mobile? Where does that human connection come from, and how does it multiply over time? Well, we ended up taking some of this case study to a couple of different arenas. One was the AARP. This is the Association of American Retired Persons. This is our older Americans organization. Maybe the largest membership organization in the world, 40 million members. And they started to see a challenge. All of a sudden, they had a wonderful business model. Back in the 60s and 70s, they were kind of created to be an advocacy arm for older Americans. And in the process, they realized that they don't have to raise a dollar at all if they can just take several different products and services and share them with their entire membership at cost, at a lower cost. And what they started to see is that products and services were not in demand anymore. And so we brought some of this same kind of thinking into this universe. And we co-created with their end users to figure out exactly what their needs were. And what we realized is that the model that they were working with was basically based on a 1950s older person, not a modern older person. In the 1950s, all of a sudden a person got older, and around age 45 to 55, they started looking for ways to actually retire, to actually unplug from life. Well, now from age 45 to 55, most people are actually looking for a second life. They're looking to reconnect with their dreams. They're looking to reconnect with their ambitions, with their family, the things that they left behind. But this becomes the way of thinking, co-creating with your end users to actually get at scale. So what we used to do in the past around focus grouping and polling, well, guess what? We're actually lifting that fourth mirror wall up, and we are actually making our end users part of that process, and we're making a much smaller feedback loop. So let me do this. My time is getting short, so I want to give you guys 5 different elements that I think are really key for any organization, wherever you are, to really be able to capture this kind of energy. And again, the tactics don't necessarily matter, but the strategy does. And we have to figure that out for all of us. Number 1, it's really important that your organization have top talent. This is really key. It's got to be people who can orchestrate creative teams. It has to be people who have that cult of innovation. It has to be people who are given the headroom to actually innovate. It's really important that at the individual level, these folks be able to have creative clash, that they can actually unleash a creative organization. And this is not a trivial task. Number 2, it's really important that that team, working together, be able to envision a better future. This means coming up with a big, bold vision. This is not about frontline changes, it's about breakthrough kinds of things. The marketplace demands it now. But what are the elements that go into that? Well, it means, like we've heard, storytelling becomes really key, but storytelling that motivates people to actually act. Now, look, that lab out in Silicon Valley that I talked about, some of the work that's now happening in Central Europe as well, folks are actually looking at big data to see how you can actually motivate a particular audience to take some kind of action. Well, this goes into the storytelling, but it doesn't substitute for the fact that you have to articulate a clear vision and message. It doesn't get in the way of the fact that you still have to have the courage to be a pioneer. Top talent, big vision. Third, it's really important that you drive breakthrough change. And the way to do that is by creating learning networks, by creating networks that are self-organizing, that can actually multiply the amount of work that's done for you. This means creating a very tight feedback loop. This means being able to share information quickly and consistently in a way that it is taken into that feedback loop. It means being able to leverage the power of the crowd. But this also means something for the individual. This means also that folks need to be focused on the whole system. If you take just a part of it, the interdependence within that system will still make your goal elusive. And so, if we look at the whole system, it's a lot easier to accelerate that kind of change. The other thing to think about with breakthroughs, especially in our industry, is while many of the other industries or sectors look at bottom line as cash flow, well, for us, we can look at multiple bottom lines. The reality is we still have to maintain our core business, that we must be able to continue the work of campaigning and advocating. But at the same time, we have to look at a second and third horizon as well. What are the emerging markets that are coming? How are you positioning for those emerging markets? And most importantly, how are you looking beyond that to the markets that you can make? That is your Horizon 3. And it is very important that you have a bit of a focus, a bipolar focus around this, around that long term and that next Monday action. Number 4, it's really important that you have an external orientation. This means really being able to apply an explorative mindset, being able to look outside of your organization, to be able to actually partner. Where you have gaps in your organization, it is very important to marry up with another organization with like minds, but with complementary skills and assets so you can very quickly position in markets that you couldn't otherwise. It's very important to think about the trends here, because the last thing you want is to fly against the wind. You have to leverage that tailwind. If there are growth markets out there, jump into them. You don't have to build a trend to ride the wave. It's also very important to take a disruptive stance here. This means actually questioning core beliefs. Why are things being done the same way if we're actually looking for a different endpoint? Now, the fifth thing, and after this I'll close, is about acting with passion and purpose. This is a really key piece. It is really important that all the folks on your team are driven by a set of values. Now, the reality is, for an organization, this is about the will to innovate. This is about if leadership has a vision, then it's easy for the team to have a culture. And that vision has to be defined. It has to be values-driven. And there has to be a sense of role modeling. Leadership has to do things slightly differently to signal that things are different. But at the end of the day, these are the 5 pieces that become really important. And part of, I'll say, acting with passion and purpose is also about this sense of mastering self and mastering some kind of profession. But without these pieces, you can't get anywhere. Number 1, orchestrating creative teams, top talent. Number 2, envisioning a better future, having a big vision. Number 3, driving breakthrough change with learning networks. Number 4, applying an explorative mindset with external orientation. And number 5, acting with passion and purpose so that you can contribute to a better world. Now, look, I said that I will close by asking one last request of all of you guys. And in a few moments, we are going to end this part of the day, and we're going to all move to another venue where it might be easier to talk and connect. But tomorrow or next week, all of us get back to work, and our work begins anew. So my final pitch to all of you is actually about our pitch. It's about the essence of why the Campaigning Bureau brought us together. It is not very often that we all get to come together. And so I would actually challenge us to create our own community of practice, our own community of interest, where we can trade information with each other, not just here today, but beyond here today. If we can come together in this kind of common cause, it would make it easier for all of us to forge the new century that we're talking about here. We could actually reinvigorate a different kind of purpose with that kind of information sharing. And we could build a community of thousands to strengthen the voices of our people and the people that we represent. And finally, like the folks who first started with this system, we can actually seek change, but at scale. The reality is, what the Campaigning Bureau teaches us is something that we all see in all of the communities where we're at. And that is that we have to stop waiting for other people to recruit the candidates. We have to stop waiting for other people to come up with the ideas. We have the responsibility to build some kind of infrastructure, some kind of vehicle where we can choose the candidates, where we can come up with the ideas, where we can come up with new policies, where we can communicate with people, where we can actually unleash the imaginations of the people in our organizations, where we can actually bring campaigners together with community organizers, together with electioneers, together with people who can manage field campaigns and people who can manage organizations and people who understand the new ways to actually bring people together. That is our opportunity, and that's why this is our time. The late Senator Paul Wellstone, big activist elected in America, he once used to tell the story of Wendell Phillips, who was a reverend who was against slavery. And in the 1940s, he used to go around the country and actually talk a lot. Well, Wendell Phillips came off the stage and his friend came up to me and said, "Brother Wendell, why are you so on fire?" And Wendell turned to him and he said, "I am on fire, Brother Nay, because we have mountains of ice before us to melt. We have mountains of ice before us to melt. So stay strong and let's stay in touch. Let's join in that effort." Thank you very much.